this entire month, we're looking at practical ways that we can face our fear. Now, I know Halloween is coming up, and there's this spookiness and the fun, scary part of Halloween. But what I'm talking about is not the fun, scary stuff. I'm talking about our real fears that we have deep down inside of us. I'm talking about our fears that maybe no one else knows about, that only we ourselves are aware of. How do we face those fears? How do we overcome those fears? How do we work on and getting over those, or work toward the process of getting over those fears? And so last week we looked at this idea that the first step is simply naming your fear. The first step is simply naming your fear. Because we can try to overcome our fears, but if we never admit what our fear is, then we've lost before we've even started. If we've never admit what our fear is, then there's no next step. And so I encouraged you guys to go out and get really practical and to name your fear, to go to a trusted adult and say, here it is, here's my fear, and just ask for some help. And once you name your fear, you can begin the hard work of understanding your fear. And that's what we're going to talk about this week. We're going to talk about how we can work on understanding our fear. Now, I grew up in Plainfield, which is like 45 minutes down the road that direction. And I was very aware growing up that Plainfield was home to the Indiana Boys School. How many of you have any idea what the Indiana Boys School is? All right, Brinkley does. All right, some of you do, some of you do. I've got some pictures here. So the Indiana Boys School, this is what used to be right on 40, like where all the big soccer fields are now. That's like the home of where the Indiana Boys School used to be. They've like scaled it back and switched it all now. It's all a different type of housing facility for inmates and people. But I was very aware growing up of the Indiana Boys School because I was 2 miles away from the boys' school. I knew that right around the corner was the boys' school. Now, that's not a big deal, right? It's not a huge deal that we had inmates in our town. The boys' school was home to juveniles that committed violent crimes, okay? Still not a huge deal, except for one thing. In the 1990s, there was a string of successful escape attempts from the Indiana Boys School. And I can vividly remember being 2 miles away from the Indiana Boys School and seeing on the news, another person has escaped from the boys' school. And my parents immediately going and locking the doors. I can remember my parents making phone calls to my grandparents, who our backyards touched each other, and just making sure they were aware and that the doors were all locked. I can remember an escapee actually being caught like really, really close to our neighborhood. It got so bad in Plainfield. The boys' school had been around for 100 years. But in 1994, there was yet another escape, and 2 inmates of the boys' school actually escaped and attacked a lady inside her house and beat her up pretty good. And so at that point, the town had had enough, and they were like, listen, you've got to make some changes. And so the inmates couldn't wear street clothes anymore, so if they escaped, they wouldn't blend in as well, and they finally put up a razor wire fence around the Indiana Boys School. Now, why do I tell you this? Because I grew up with an awareness that right down the street was a facility where people regularly escaped. Now, I wondered to myself, if this was just my own mind, like maybe one person escaped and like I had just remembered it to be bigger than what it actually was. And so I did some research, okay? I did some research, and the boys' school was running for about 100 years. Actually, Charles Manson, famous serial killer guy, he was at the Indiana Boys School. He escaped in 1968 and ran off to Utah before he was caught. And then in the 90s, I couldn't get numbers. There was no place that had numbers. I don't know why they wouldn't post those numbers, but there were no numbers. But during the 90s, there actually was a string of successful escape attempts. And so I grew up with this fear that someone was going to escape and come and hurt me or my family. Which is probably why, when I told you guys last week that I was afraid when my grandparents were watching America's Most Wanted, and it all ties together, right? That's probably why I was afraid that guy was going to come after me. Fast forward to where I'm in high school. Our family is still very aware of this fear that just kind of got instilled in us a little bit. We live on the other side of Plainfield now. We live close to Interstate 70, and so my parents are like, you never, just be careful, because we had horses at the time, so at night we had to walk across a field out to a barn, and they were like, just be aware of your surroundings, you don't know who's coming off I-70. There was also like a guy living in a tent that we didn't know who he was or what he was doing in the field, kind of like a field down from my parents, so we were all just very aware, right? Very aware. But I was also very aware that while I had this fear, my dad also had this fear. And so one of my favorite things to do, I did this at least once a week. I kid you not. One of my favorite things to do was to wait till he had gone out to the barn to do some work. Feed the horses, piddle around, work on whatever project he was working on. And the moment he got inside the barn, I would peek around. There was like a little tree line. I would peek around the tree line, and I would make sure he wasn't going to come back out and get anything. And then I would take off running as quietly and as quickly as I could across our field to the barn. And when I would get to the barn, I would peek in. I would wait till his back was turned, and I would go up behind him, and I'd be like, ah! Right? Scared him to death every time. Like, I'm surprised I didn't give him a heart attack. There were multiple times that he turned around like this. Of course, he didn't hit me because he recognized it was me, but it was awesome. It was absolutely incredible. And so there was this fear that was instilled inside of us, our entire family, and sometimes I may or may not have used that fear to my advantage to scare my dad. It was awesome. It was a blast. But hey, we all have some fears. And maybe for you, it's not people escaping. I don't get the sense that there's a big fear in Brazil or Clay County or the surrounding Wabash Valley area that there's a bunch of escapees running around. So maybe for you, it's not people escaping and coming after you, but we all have some fears. We all have some fears. And our goal is to name those fears and to begin to understand those fears and how they work in our lives. Because if we can understand those fears and how they work in our lives, we can begin to process those fears, and we can begin to work through those fears, and we can begin to grow in ourselves because of our fears and God working through us. So for this, we're going to look at how Jesus again handled his fears. We're going to jump back into John chapter 13. If you'll remember, this is the Last Supper. This is the moment where Jesus is eating the Passover feast with his disciples for the very final time. Jesus is very aware that the cross is coming. Jesus is very aware of everything that is going to happen over the course of the next few hours. And it scares him. And last week we talked about how Jesus was fearful, and he named his fear, and he said, listen, you're going to betray me. And he said, listen, you're going to deny me. And he told them he was going to go to the cross. And it's not that he wasn't scared. He wasn't like this robot that was just headed toward the cross fearlessly. He didn't want to go, but he was naming his fears. And we can see him begin to process those fears. And we can begin to see how he is understanding those fears and how they relate to his life. This verse right here where we're starting happens right after Jesus says, Judas, you're going to betray me. And Judas walks out. And here's what it says. When he, Judas, had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know you are my disciples if you have love for one another. I love what Jesus does here. If you remember back to last week, right before he admits that Judas is going to betray him, his heart was troubled. He was feeling the emotions of what was coming. And he names his fear. He says, Judas, you're going to betray me. And he goes into this kind of like processing mode where he is kind of trying to understand. He's trying to flesh out what this fear is going to look like for him and for his disciples. And we can see that he's saying, all right, it's time. The Son of Man is going to be glorified. God is going to be glorified. It's time. And he says, listen, I'm not going to be with you very much longer. Where I'm going, you can't come. And so Jesus is beginning this process of not only naming his fear, but he is beginning this process, and he's been working on it actually for a while. He says, just as I have told the Jews, so now I say to you, where I'm going, you can't come. So he's told the Jews, he's been aware, and he's began fleshing out this idea of, okay, here's my fear, here's what it means for me. And when we get down to the end, for Jesus, this fear meant he was going to pass on his message to his disciples, and his disciples were going to pass that message on to other people. How? Through this new commandment, that you love one another. And so, for me personally, if Jesus names his fears and then begins to flesh out what those fears could possibly look like in his own life, then I feel like we should be doing the same thing. We should be naming our fears and begin fleshing out what those fears look like in our own lives. And for me, it comes down to answering a few questions about our fears. These few questions are this. First of all, why do I have this fear? Why do I have this fear? Why is this fear a part of who I am? Maybe for you, it stems from something in your childhood. Maybe for you, it's something that your parents were afraid of, like thunderstorms or something, and so they kind of passed that on to you. Maybe you had an experience recently where you've been hurt emotionally, and so you've kind of built up these walls and built up these fears. But it's really important that we begin to ask ourselves and we begin to honestly answer this question, why do I have this fear? Why is it a part of my life? And so often we just kind of pass over this question. We don't really address it. We don't really look at our past. We don't really look at the walls we've built up. We just let it go. And we're like, yeah, that fear is a part of who I am. What if part of processing our fear was being able to answer why it's a part of our lives and being able to tear down some of those walls? And so the first question is, why do I have this fear? The second question is this. How likely is it that this fear or part of this fear will happen? How likely is it that this fear or part of this fear will happen? You know, maybe you are afraid that you are going to get attacked by a shark. And you're getting ready to go to the beach, and it's causing a lot of anxiety, and it's making you super nervous. You can begin to ask yourself, how likely is this to happen? And the honest answer is, it's really not very likely. And so we have to ask this question, and if it's not very likely, we can cycle back to this question and say, why do I have this fear then? What are some ways that I can begin to process this? Third question is this. Is there something I can do to lessen the likelihood of this fear happening? If so, what action steps can I take? All right, so why do I have this fear? How likely is this fear to happen? And is there something I can do to lessen the effects of this fear? What action steps can I take? And the last thing is this. If this fear is occurring, what's the best way to deal with it? how can I get the help I need during a difficult situation? So let's go back to Jesus addressing his fear. Why does Jesus have this fear that he's going to the cross? Because he's going to the cross. He knows that. There's not a question in his mind. He is going to the cross. How likely is this fear, or part of this fear that's going to happen? It's going to happen, right? Sometimes we face fears where it may not happen, like me. Why do I have a fear about people escaping and coming after me? Because I grew up in a time and an era in a place close to a facility where there are a lot of escapees. How likely is that to happen? It's not very likely. Sometimes we have these fears where they're not very likely, and we can begin to talk ourselves down and be like, all right, this is not very likely. And as I moved, I was able to take that fear and say, all right, this isn't very likely, but I can scare my dad pretty good with it, right? But for Jesus, this was really going to happen. There was no escaping it. There was no way around it. He was going to go to the cross. Is there something I can do to lessen the likelihood of this fear happening? For Jesus, there wasn't. For me, I could lock the doors. Simple as that. And just be aware of my surroundings. And if this fear is occurring, what's the best way to deal with it? And this is where we see Jesus really do some processing. And Jesus says, all right, this is going to happen. And so he begins to tell his followers, this is going to happen. And he begins to say things throughout the entire 4 Gospels. I'm going to go to the cross. When I'm gone, I want you to. And here in John, we see him say, I'm only going to be with you a little while longer, and when I'm gone, I want you to love others. It's through your love that they will know you are my disciples. And so we begin to process our fears. We begin to understand our fears. We begin to work on our fears. And really, guys, this is one really solid way for us to be able to overcome some lesser fears and to really help ourselves grow from some more serious fears. If you're fearful that someone's going to come attack you, this is a solid way to say, okay, I'm going to lock my doors and I'm going to be aware of my surroundings. I understand why I have the fear. I understand it's definitely not likely in Brazil, Indiana, right? I understand I can lock the doors. But sometimes there are fears we can't escape. What happens when a family member is on their deathbed? And you are fearful because you don't know what your life is going to be like without that family member. In those moments, you face these questions. Why do I have this fear? A family member is passing away. There's nothing I can do to lessen the likelihood. It's going to happen. If this fear is occurring, what's the best way to deal with it? Who do I need to talk to? How can I make sure I get in my final goodbye? There are a lot of fears where how likely is it going to happen? And it's happening. Maybe for you, it is a family member that's sick. Maybe for you, you are caught in addiction and you know you're addicted. And you know that it's happening and you know that it's there. And you are fearful that you're never going to get out. What's the best way to deal with this? In these difficult and complex situations where you are facing issues that you can't come to terms with on your own, it is really, really vitally important that you talk to a professional. I've had moments where I've been living my fears out. And the thing that helped me through it, outside of God, was having a professional counselor walk alongside me and talk with me and help me process it and help me understand it and help me walk through it and help me work through it and help me get to the other side of it. Maybe for you tonight, you are facing one of those moments where you have this fear and you know that it's happening and you're just not sure where to go from here. I want to encourage you to talk to a trusted adult and ask for some serious help. And know that there is honor and courage in going to talk to a professional, in seeking and getting the help that you need. Because we have to understand our fears if we are going to process them, if we are going to work through them. Because our fears are real. You have some real fears. And I have some real fears. And so this week, I want to encourage you guys. I'm going to send out an email on our email thread. And I'm going to send out a Facebook post with this graphic on the Facebook post. And I want to encourage you guys, the practical challenge this week is to simply walk through this process with something that you fear. Maybe start with something small, like me and my fear of escapees, but with the goal of working towards something larger, working toward that fear that you've never told anyone. Working toward that fear that is deep inside you that no one realizes is there. And you begin to ask yourselves these questions. Now, I want to encourage you to take some real time and work through these questions and begin to process them. You see, shortly after Jesus processes his fear, he does what we talked about at the end of last week, where he stands up and he says, "It's time. Let's go." And I want to encourage you guys that your fears can lead to a moment of growth where you say, "It's time. Let's go." And so this week, I want to encourage you to take some time and work through this and really begin to understand some of the things you fear. Check this out.